All right. Welcome back, friends and comrades. Here we are for our first session on Losurdo's Class Struggle by popular demand. The group has decided to examine this text. We've just started it. Today, we're going to be talking about chapter 1 and chapter 2 on the different forms of class struggle. A few just opening points, and then I want everyone to sort of chime in with thoughts, questions, etc. But I think it's striking that he begins the text with this claim on behalf of Habermas that class struggle in this stage of late welfare capitalism, post-war capitalism has vanquished, is done. And Habermas seems to interpret that as an assault on the Marxist theory of class. And the Marxist theory of class in Habermas's conception is primarily economistic. So immediately you have the suggestion that Marx and Engels can't think class other than the old industrial proletariats. And Losurdo is rightly agitated with this widespread liberal sort of abuse of the history of Marxism. So it's very clear, I think, where he's coming from in terms of the impetus for this text. And I think it's actually quite useful for us, especially as we face this situation of I was just listening to a podcast after the Trump election from the right wing, and the title of their podcast, it was this guy at Hillsdale College. I don't know, some right wing Christian Baptist college. And the title of it was The New Class War. And everything that they were discussing regarding the uprising for support for Trump was through a prism of this right-wing populist conception of class. And then I think on the left side, we have for quite a while had a very, what you might call plural conception of class. We are very open to an intersectional conception of class on the left. And of course, we've been riddled, especially in the United States, with this nauseating debate of class reductionism versus race reductionism. And I say nauseating precisely because one of the insights that Losurdo brings to bear in this text that I think is pertinent for the ideological struggles that we face is this conception that he argues, which is that when class struggle becomes hot, when it becomes interconnected, when it becomes overdetermined, when it becomes overloaded, when it leads to a generalized expansion from its original site, in the case of 1848, it started as a civil war, basically amongst the classes in France, which spilled over to a world war. Yeah. So there's this internationalist connection to class struggles. And so I think that we've lost touch with this idea of the interconnectedness of class struggles. And I don't know, like I have the sense that there's a lot of profound relevance in what Losurdo is bringing to bear on these points. And I don't know, my sense of it is that well, Marx and Engels put forward the theory of historical materialism in the German Ideology, which is an early text of theirs, probably arguably their most important next to Capital. And in this text, we have the famous phrase that the history of human societies is, to paraphrase, characterized by the struggle of classes. And it's always used in the German in the plural. It's always class struggles in the plural. And one of the things I was saying is that you have emerge at the moment when class struggles get hot, anti-Marxist, or let's say non-Marxist, or we could say liberal as well as conservative. You have a whole variety of what Losurdo calls other paradigms that attempt to theorize class struggle, but they attempt to theorize it by incorporating different paradigms, such as Losurdo pinpoints the ethnological paradigm, right, which posits that class struggle is largely reducible to superior species, or they usually rely on a biological conception of class. Later, it would be like a vitalistic theory of class. or even in the case of Nietzsche, it would be a physiological conception of class, right? You have also emerged, of course, the racialization of class, right, which is one paradigm on which this occurs. But you also have within the bourgeoisie what Losurdo calls the obscure, making obscure class struggle, right? Making obscure class struggle. And when I was listening to this podcast, I had the sense that that's what was going on, right? That there is a sense that there is a kind of, when people say today that there's a kind of vulgar Marxism in the air, that like vulgar Marxism tells more truth than most everything you hear from commentators and experts and so on. I think this is sort of what they mean, which is that Marx and Engels' discovery in the German ideology rings true, but then the question becomes one of a kind of theory of social conflict, right? So Losurdo will say that. Losurdo will say that the insight of historical materialism into this class struggle as the basis of the social foundation of sociality, of the logic of societies and civilizations. He will say that this is a theory that requires social conflict. It's a theory of social antagonisms. It's a theory for how we account for social conflict in the sphere of the family, in the sphere of relations between men and women, not only in the sphere of political economy, right? You have the question, I think very importantly, that a lot of socialists talked about from 1848 all the way up to the First World War, of what was called the social question. And the social question you could understand as basically how the class system at its organic sort of cellular level will reorganize society. The social question is the question of the mutation of the class problem. And that is why when it comes to the national struggles outside of the core regions in Europe, Marx and Engels will both argue that the national question becomes the social question. I think it's very important. And that is the sort of formula by which we can understand a great confusion regarding this idea that Marxism is a fundamentally class reductionist doctrine or a fundamentally class reductionist understanding of struggle, which it's not. Now, where Losurdo philologically relies on is very interesting, as he does. He relies on the personal correspondence of a gentleman by the name of Lagarde, who was his daughter's partner, who later became like a famous socialist follower of Marx. And he was once in the home of Marx and Engels, I think when they were in London. And he heard Marx and Engels speak very frequently and commonly about the national question, especially in Ireland. And so it's interesting to me because on the one hand, Losurdo recognizes that in the journalism of Marx, the Rheinische Zeitung, his early journalism before he resigned from that, he's constantly talking about international struggles. He's constantly talking about national struggles, but that at a certain point, a lot of the theoretical production of Marx, national struggles do become a bit more marginal, right? So there is a sense in which the centrifugal point of class struggle does remain the industrial proletariat. That doesn't necessarily mean that Marx privileges the industrial proletariat exclusively. Why? Because Losurdo shows that Marx, on multiple occasions, says that the US Civil War is the greatest example of class struggle in his time. So we're going to get into the breakdown of what Losurdo helpfully calls the genus and the species of class struggle and the multiplicity that they take. The multiplicity that they take internal also to bourgeoisie. Because to go back to Lagarde, he also said something which Marx said as a phrase. He said, in this house, referring to Marx's house, we welcome the taking of sides in class struggles internal to bourgeoisie, which I found very interesting for Marx to say. And I read that as a strategic point regarding Marx's view that if the original insight, philosophical insight that opens historical materialism is that basically it's class struggle all the way down, it's class struggle internal to each class, right, in some sense, and that the locus of analysis requires a certain rationality, requires a certain Hegelian dialectical understanding of that. Because one of the things that I found very insightful here was to look at the way that Marx debated Proudhon on the national question and on religion. In both instances, we see a sophisticated dialectical analysis of both the national question and the religious question, which was that for Proudhon, he had a kind of what we might call ultra-leftist view, which was he had a suspicion of anyone who would champion the nation, right? In other words, he had no tolerance for seeing the rational kernel in an element of antagonism, which is impure, because that's another big theme here. Class struggle is impure. It's not a pure terrain, right? It's riddled with contradictions. And that, I think, is where the Hegelian emphasis on sublation becomes so significant. And we will see next time when we look at the notion of the dialectic of recognition and how that then, in Losurdo's view, splits emancipation struggles, right, around a more elemental form, right, which would include, in fact, the abolition of slavery in the American context, as well as the national question as a priority, but also would mean something, and this is something that you may remember from our study of Western Marxism, befuddles me, and hopefully you, maybe somebody can help us with this, that there does emerge a sort of distinction, yeah? And even in the opening introduction notice what Losurdo points to, which was a letter between Marx and Engels where they said to each other, we are not sure whether a revolution in the interior of the core capitalist region can occur if capitalism is stable, if the system is effectively not in crisis. That was very interesting to me because it reminded me of a seminar I once took with the great French philosopher Alain Badiou. And he said to me, during May 68, capitalism had zero crisis. I found that very interesting. And I've always thought that that represented Badiou's own, what I consider kind of Rousseauist voluntarism, in the sense that for Badiou, one of the things that you should not do, which would, maybe you could say, present a kind of overly mechanistic theory of class struggle, which is to refuse to organize only in the face of crisis. That would be reactionary in some sense, which is why Badiou he puts such a big onus on the necessity of political organization, irrespective of crisis. I mean, that's exactly, speaking of the Trump election, that was one of the things that these conservative commentators were making a point on, which was a valid point, which is, and it's sad that they recognize this, and I think many on the left don't recognize this, which is that the entire media apparatus has told us that capitalism is recovering, we have full employment, everyone's fine and dandy, right? But yet still an antagonism exists beneath the surface, right? So in that sense, I fully agree that we are back into some kind of strange Dickensian social arrangement in which bourgeois society has presented these masks and illusions to cover over, to obfuscate, to disavow, right? An antagonism for which they don't have a firsthand experience in. And then they learn a brutal lesson, like Trump gets elected, right? So that's one thing I do want to spend some time on, which is ideology in class. I really benefited a lot from the section on ideology. I really benefited a lot from that because especially what we find here are the various means and mechanisms by which the class struggle becomes obscured, by which it gets rerouted, which is beyond only the racializing of it. That's an original. I mean, in other words, this is a great theme of Lukács's Destruction of Reason, which is that the racial paradigm of Gobineau, and then later Guizot and others, who are referenced in Losurdo's text, of course. Well, we know that that is a response to the implicit universal demands of the French Revolution. In other words, it's a nominalizing of a form of plebeian social antagonism, right? It's a nominalizing insofar as it's trying to cover over. In some sense, you could say it's almost like a reverse fetishization onto it in a certain way. So, so I mean, there's a lot in this text that I think is quite powerful for us to consider here. And I want to invite people also to speak beyond the text to ways that the text speaks to them in this moment that we're experiencing the Trump phenomenon and all of that. And I think the other important point to note here is that once the class struggle reaches a point of what Losurdo refers to as global war or a situation of a kind of multiplicity of crises, he doesn't elaborate it here, but in his work on Bonapartism, which has recently been translated, he really brings it out, which is the notion that the bourgeoisie summons forth a solution for the stabilization and therefore for the pacification of the class struggle, which is another way to think about Trumpism itself, right? And that's always how I've thought about Trump, right? Which is that, yes, he is some kind of obscure result of the bourgeoisie's refusal to incorporate a true acknowledgement of the basis of social conflict as driven by this unseen class struggle, right? He names it in an extremely vulgar way, right? And he himself nominalizes it, which is, all of the stuff on the anti-immigrant thing and all of that. So that very much interests me, the function of the Bonapartist as a restoration figure, as a figure of restoration. The other notion here is, of course, counter-revolution as very important. And the different valences that counter-revolution can take, right? Yeah, so I mean, I was also very struck, by the way, on the whole discussion on the US Civil War. I think Losurdo shines a light on that in the study of Marxism that's very, very useful. Um, uh, and then, of course, the other thing that very much struck me was the emergence, and this will interest those of you that study psychoanalysis, of the psychopathologization of class as one of the paradigms of nominalism, right? For which Gustave Le Bon is referenced as the sort of seminal thinker of bourgeois thought. And that is interesting to me because I would argue that that paradigm of obscuring class struggle has remained highly consistent. And of course, another seminal thinker there is, of course, Alexis de Tocqueville. And the way that Alexis de Tocqueville nominalizes class is interesting, right? Because it actually emanates from a perverse combination of a psychopathologization of the plebeian as mad, as unruly, as psychotic. But it also relies on a weird ethnological paradigm in which American individualism, right, becomes that which the European cannot assume, right? So he fetishizes American individualism and says that part of the reason why they've been able to handle their thing, of course, there's the bleep of the Civil War, which he can't fully account for, but at least at the level of our civil society, right? Yeah, the formation of this libertarian individualism gives us a certain leg up. And I think part of what de Tocqueville's argument is that it is the solution for the pacification of the unruly mob, right? So de Tocqueville becomes an interesting point of reference, and he's one of Losurdo's favorite liberal points of reference. And I think studying de Tocqueville through the lens of Losurdo is extremely useful in the same way that our study of Hannah Arendt is useful, because de Tocqueville remains um, a prized sort of great sort of theoretician of American society, of kind of historical sociology, of civil society, but embedded within de Tocqueville is an anti-revolutionary thrust, which is extremely robust and almost even just as insidious as others. I mean, it reminds me of what Matilda was saying in Discord regarding Ralph Waldo Emerson and the fact that Emerson had a painting of Carlyle in his home, and that Emerson also possesses this combination of an aristocratic and liberal orientation, which itself has a certain anti-revolutionary thrust to it, right? So, be careful with Losurdo because he will kill all of your liberal darlings. He will kill them. And you got to kind of get prepared for that. Um, Obviously, the references to Nietzsche throughout this are very interesting. I found them very useful. In the sense of, I mean, he doesn't dig into it too much, but the idea of positioning Nietzsche as a thinker in between the destruction of chattel slavery and a thinker who is trying to invent and does invent new paradigms for further suppressing the class struggle is I think a useful framework for thinking Nietzsche's role in all of this. Um, so anyways, I mean, we can go back and break down the various genus and species of the class struggle. And I think the thing about that's interesting to me is that exploitation of workers is not necessarily prioritized, right? So again, going back to this Habermasian view on Marxism as a class reduction, Losurdo actually doesn't even think that the Marxist view on class, and I wonder if others agree with this, has a necessary privileging of the industrial proletariat in some way that would be, I mean, to an extent, you have to understand that the claim there is that the struggle for women's liberation and the struggle of colonial oppression, all three possess a common point of a relationship between capital and labor. They don't escape that. They don't escape that. So it's not about what I think a lot of liberals have read into Marxism, which is that all you care about is this crust of workers, right? That's not really the claim of Marx. You know what I'm saying? I think that would be interesting to ask why the liberals have developed this stereotype regarding Marxism. What is it a reflection of? In some cases, I think the debates in the US have only exacerbated this misunderstanding because a lot of Marxists have actually doubled down and said, oh, yeah, you're right. That is all that we care about, which I think is a mistake for Marxists to do that. I don't know if others agree with that, but my feeling is that it is. What do you guys think? You know what I'm saying? Like this kind of knee-jerk response to uh I mean, I see this all over the place with the left. I suppose it's a knee-jerk response to uh the strategic inadequacy of the left overall at an institutional level. And so it's almost maybe perhaps like a lashing out against that, maybe. Um, so I don't know. I mean, that's something for us to discuss. I think that the uh other thing that I wanted to say here, and again I invite folks to jump in here, is I mean this whole business on religion was very, very useful for me. Useful insofar as what I found so essential here, and Losurdo has helped me a lot in understanding the Marxist view on religion, let's say, which is that religion is to be understood as a sort of elementary form of ideology, a kind of ideological form in utero, and that is the notion of opium. Like you could think about the opium of the masses, that phrase, as sort of like this idea of being pilled. We always say you're like grill pilled, or you take the red pill, you take the black pill. I think that's actually how we could think about it, which is that religion is the first pill, right? And so it's therefore this kind of initiatory. It like introduces the rudiments of what is otherwise a kind of rudimentary or nascent theory of the class struggle, right? It's kind of in utero, right? And that's why, notice this. What are the texts that Marx and Engels write at the moment of a defeat in the class struggle of their time? It tends to be texts about the history of religion, uh, in which the history of religious movements are shown to be expressions of class struggle in an emancipatory way. The best example, of course, is Engels' famous text on the peasant war in Germany about Thomas Müntzer. So there is a sense, and then, of course, Engels' later work on how early socialism in the history of Christianity resembles almost in exact form, which is a very anti-Nietzschean effort, by the way, um, resembles exactly the history of modern socialism, in some sense. And that is why when anti-colonial struggles are happening, Marx and Engels are analyzing them not as purely anti-religious. People are attaching to religion in those struggles, and they're capable of seeing the rational kernel as to why, the logic behind their identification with that. And that made me immediately think of how we view Islamism and Hamas and Palestine, insofar as, do we want to take this Proudhonist, almost like overly puritanical view, I would say anti-dialectical view, where we cannot separate a logic? Because you see, Engels had this idea that ideology is a struggle in a terrain of power. It's like a terrain of power, and you can identify what he called ideological struggles from below. There's also ideological struggles from on high. So it's about a certain class literacy, right, of understanding the emergence of ideologies, and religion is a part of that. So I don't know if you guys were moved by that. I found it interesting that in our time, you notice that a lot of Marxists were talking about religion in the wake of political defeat. The texts on St. Paul by Agamben, Zizek, Alain Badiou, and others are examples of that. In the 90s, we had a huge flurry of interest in St. Paul as well. St. Paul is the foundation of universalism. Part of that was an implicit dialogue with liberal identity politics as well. So I think the treatment of religion is very nuanced, and also it's not to be understood as an instrumentalized theory of the superstructure. In other words, even if you have a national struggle, it's often the case that the impurity of their ideology could be assessed as a separate point from the higher outcome of the social question. And remember the conflation between the national question and the social question. Do you see what I mean? So I wonder what you all thought about that. I was very moved by that. The other point, of course, is the instrumentalization of the Enlightenment. And so it's a perfect example, actually, because you could see it on the flip side, which was there are reactionary uses of the Enlightenment, just as there are reactionary uses of religion. And he gives several examples, I think, in this way. So that helped me see the way that it's not an idealism in which we should assess the strength of a concept or a tradition of thought. No, like take for example, Rousseauism. One of the things that Losurdo will say regarding Rousseauism is that by the time of the 1830s, Rousseauism was already a social contract theory, was already associated with reactionary thought. So Rousseauism had lost its emancipatory potential. You know what I mean? So that is a very interesting point of the kind of necessity for a class struggle perspective that's capable of making these discriminations. You know what I'm saying? Across ideology and ideological struggle and all of that. Yeah, because, you know, like, even though Münzer was a madman who thought that God was giving him divine blessing for the peasant war, that divine blessing also entailed the demand for the radical abolition of private property, which was almost like the first moment at which you had that as a revolutionary demand in European history. So I think that's a good example of not refusing something purely on ideological grounds, but seeing ideology as an impure battlefield is the thing that I take from that. And then, of course, he also says something very, very, very useful, which is that historical materialism always insists upon a historical and social foothold, and that nature, this is very interesting, I think, especially when you get to Engels's Dialectics of Nature later. Nature, most of the time, becomes the site for a further obscuring of the stakes of the class struggle. That kind of goes into this notion of the other paradigms and nominalizing class struggle. And I do wonder what folks think about that, especially as we look at the ecological crisis, which Losurdo does mention a few things regarding that. I do agree with him primarily that historical materialism is about, you see, because part of what the reactionary theory of nature has to do with, and he gives a bunch of examples of this, is the idea that in the face of a great uprising or of a great social instability, or in just, let's say, the appearance of class struggle, there is an attempt for a restoration whereby there's a kind of theory of a return to nature. So you see this a lot in German idealism. He uses the example of Schiller. I mean, Nietzsche's entire wider theory of nature is itself a highly politicized example of this as well, whereby Nietzsche is trying to re-theorize nature as itself reflective of capitalist exploitation. So in that sense, Nietzsche, in a way, well, at least as I read him and as Lukács reads him, basically trying to take the category of nature and argue that expropriation, oppression, and the kind of brutality of everyday life, that constitutes nature in some sense. So it's a sort of anyways, so that I found quite interesting. I will stop here, and I've said a lot. Invite folks, please. Yes, yes. Is it how do I pronounce your name? Aramis?
Yeah, it's my pen name. It's Aramis. Yeah.
How are you? Welcome.
Aramis. I'm doing well, thank you. That part on nature, that really resonated with me in the text. And actually, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was very much dissatisfied with society, and I was actually thinking about I should return to nature. I should go out and become a wanderer, and I felt like there was really something wrong. Was it I thought it was humanity as a whole, but then now, and in the text, it even says like, no, nature, from what I got at least, it said that nature is pretty much already being exploited. Like there is nowhere in nature that you can go, for one. And then another thing is like nature is a part of the productive process. Like it is where in part we draw value. And so I kind of, as I grew older, I sort of realized that that's not really possible to just kind of divorce yourself. And and then the text, I think that it's kind of, he correctly redirects us that it's the class struggle in the way that you kind of outlined and he outlines, where it's between the workers and then the colonialism and then also the feminism, I think are better things to focus on rather than just wanting to like divorce yourself from humanity as a whole.
Well, I mean, it is very interesting though. Like I know a friend of mine was at the University of Virginia, um, and he was telling me that I think that, a lot of the scholars there were making this claim, and they kind of saw themselves as Marxists. They're making this claim that after the Floyd uprising, um, there was a sense that the liberal ruling class kind of overwhelmed the left. And so we lost with Sanders, then we lost with the Floyd uprising. Lost is relative, but you see my point. Like there was a feeling that it was co-opted. And he was saying that like a lot of people were started to advocate like kind of micro politics or even the online space of like to become grill pilled and to sort of resign. So there was a sense of a resignation politics. And I think that that's sort of how he's conceptualizing nature, in the sense of this sense that class struggle, and part of the thing is ethical, I think, like an ethics of the epistemology of class and like what it means to be a Marxist, because this shit's not actually um digestible for a lot of people. Like it's not easy. And I think most of us on this call have a certain capacity for it, but it's not easy to see the world through class. I don't think it's easy. And I don't think that most people are predisposed to see the world through class. It takes a certain militancy, right? And I'm not saying that it's like, for an elite. I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying that I think the inside of Marx is fire. And it's like, it's so true that that it's true because it produces so much reaction from it, from its insights in some sense. And I think that a lot of people will shy away from it out of a perceived loss or out of a perceived defeat or something like that. Or you know what I'm saying? Like when the forces of reaction feel like they've overwhelmed us. So in that sense, that's why I feel like that Jew is so correct when he said that politics is about fidelity. Fidelity, right? To remaining within this terrain. And also, I think the epistemology here is also one of like Althusser has that point in Reading Capital where he argues that the epistemology of Marx and Capital is no longer an epistemology of sight. It's no longer as like I see class, because you see a lot of what Losurdo's working with here is like Marx as a journalist, like Marx as a commentator on international affairs and the capacity to discriminate various instantiations of the class struggle. It's very empirical. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not necessarily a philosophical account, as I see it. And I think that's actually one of its merits. Do you know what I mean? One of the merits of this analysis of class is to equip people with being able to metabolize class and not let it overwhelm you. Because otherwise, I think that class can be very fucking potent. Sorry. Okay. Matume, is it?
It's Umtume. How you doing?
Welcome. I'm
Peace.
good.
Great to be here. I mean, I will say off the bat that I agree. I find this text extremely rich, though this is not my first Losurdo dance. So I was coming here expecting, some good movements. I want to go to the class struggles in the plural because I think there's something he's doing there that is I don't know if he realizes, I don't know how connected he was to certain types of struggles like the black struggle here in the States. But there's something that he's doing here that to me is kind of kicking two people's butts at the same time. One is, and I'll say, is there is a treatment towards black liberation that we don't become a class subject until post-slavery by many Western Marxists, right? We until we become wage laborers, we don't enter the real fundamental kind of class conversation. The pre-slavery period is treated like a prehistory, right? This is what Walter Rodney, I think, talks about pretty excessively. Some of Fanon. I even think this is part of what Gerald Horne is saying, though I don't agree with everything Horne puts out. I think this is one of the fundamental core things of what Horne is talking about, right? And I mean, and when he talks about it, refers to the multiplicity of shapes and forms that class struggles can assume. To me, I'm really appreciative of Losurdo because what he's doing is he's really echoing what people in like George Jackson was saying in the 60s. And when they were yelling at the white left for not recognizing this, and he's doing this, and I find it deeply appreciative. But he's doing another thing that I find very interesting because the Black liberal space has also adopted this idea that we did not have a classed society pre-slavery as well. That's why you'll have these, ideas like Black Panther would still be a monarchy if it was never touched, right? It would still be in monarchy. They wouldn't have had a class struggle if they never met Europeanism in Africa, right? And I find this text, extremely rich because what he's doing is he's supporting to me other non-European
Yeah.
Marxist interpretations like Rodney and people. And you put this in unison. I'm actually coincidentally reading Rodney right now, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And the way that they have synthesis is quite remarkable, I must say. They have a synthesis that I find very, very potent, right? There's a lot of other things, but I'll let other people go. I also was very touched by the religion thing, and I think that brings into the Hamas question really in front. And I'm just going to say it. It's right there to me, and
Yeah.
it's there for
Yeah.
all of our faces to be dealing with. But I'll leave it at that.
Oh, beautiful. It's really, really great comment and nice to have you in the group. I mean, one of the things we see here is Marx's position on this on the Civil War, according to Losurdo's reading, just quickly, and then I'll go immediately to Connor very quickly because I think he says that you could understand Marx's strategy, his letter to Lincoln, his general journal articles in the New York Tribune, and say support for the North and all of that, was understood in an international context because he noticed that it totally changed the demands of the white workers in England, where he referred to them as an enslaved class in miniature, which I thought was an interesting phrase. On the other hand, he said strategically, this must happen as a necessary abolition, a class abolition, the ending of slavery, in order for labor to be dignified. And that I felt interesting as a certain teleological argument regarding capitalism itself, right? In other words, the great conflagration between capital and labor needs to expunge this aristocratic baggage that the South has maintained through the planter class. And then he shows that all of their obfuscation of the slavery situation had these feudal frameworks of justification through things like the appeal to otium, which of course was one of Nietzsche's. That is one of the sources where Nietzsche is a thinker of the reinvention of slavery, because he wants to introduce this category that like Fitzu and these crazy Southern intellectuals were using to justify slavery around culture, right? Which is slavery is necessary because this is Aristotle's insight into otium, right? That we can only think of great culture through the existence of this enslaved class. They're the precondition of that. And because they're the precondition of that, we treat them so well. In fact, we treat them better than you British treat your working class, right? That's the level of insidiousness that's going on in the sort of rationale. Because I've been reading Eugene Genovese's work on the theology of the Southern planter class. It's crazy shit. Anyways, Connor, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to second something Mtume was saying. It's impossible to read Losurdo and not think of Gaza, just like straight up. But I remember like one moment, especially when they were talking about Ireland and the national question, and it was something like, the first question is a question of land, and a question of the control over the land is a social question, and the social question is a national question. And it was just like, you could plug that in, and that is absolutely what's going on in Gaza to this day, right? So we're very much still with these questions. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about religion. It's such an interesting topic. And I just liked how Losurdo was kind of talking about how religion and religious movements are a sort of way to like gain class consciousness, right? Which is obviously true. And, maybe just applying this to our own historical moment, one of the strongest voting blocks in this country is, of course, evangelical Christians. It's like, it's hard to imagine, forget this election, like Roe v. Wade being overturned, if not for these absolute fanatics, right? And there's something to that, it's like so strong, it's persisted throughout literally generations now for this political project to be realized, and it worked. That's not to say we can't do anything about it, but you get my point. And yeah, just talking a little bit more about why is it that Marxists sort of return to this question of religion when we've lost. I'm reminded of Fred Jameson in The Political Unconscious. His way of reading literature is, of course, an allegorical method. But if you know anything about Jameson, that method is itself inspired by the early church fathers reading the Bible, right? And for Jameson, then, the way that these church fathers were reading the Bible was as an informed, a teleological understanding of their own faith, right? Which is to say that Christianity at least situates itself within a historical project, right? Like the Messiah doesn't just show up instantaneously. It's something that is contingent and based upon our behavior. And what we're really talking about then is they're imagining what they're doing as a historical teleological project. And if then in moments of like leftist failure, Marxist failure, we return to this question of religion or maybe Christianity more specifically, it seems to me that indicates a loss of faith in the Marxist project, right? And how can we restore a sense of faith in that?
Yeah.
So yeah, some speculations, but
no, it's good. I mean, it's also the fundamentals of historical materialism, because religion implants, if we take this theory of the pill and the in utero struggle, it also implants a tradition. And a tradition is a historical realization, has to be, right? So like it or not, our tradition of struggle, the revolutionary tradition, has a prehistory, which Engels could only theorize in the wake of a great defeat. So I felt like Losurdo's point regarding Marx and Engels is almost like class struggle as a wager. You know what I'm saying? And even this notion of the fact that they don't fetishize the industrial proletariat, the only reason that they lean on the industrial proletariat is a wager of a strategic nature that they will be most successful in contesting capital and contesting the capital wage labor relation of oppression. It's not to be understood as some type of because I mean, I think you do get a sense of that in our study of the 1844 manuscripts, when Marx is talking about how the wage laborer is excluded and alienated from bourgeois society. They have this animalistic nature, which their humanity is prevented from expressing itself. Well, in that regard, we'll see next time, I think you do get the introduction, and here we go back to Matume's point regarding slavery, because what Losurdo is going to say here is that Hegel's conception of the dialectic of recognition actually comes into play in class struggle in such a way that what's introduced is a logic of freedom, a logic that, yeah, maybe Christianity in its primitive form of thinking liberation can think, but I think we can also criticize religion as itself an ideological form which is not capable of going farther. So that would actually be a question that I would have about religion, which is, can religion fully do the deed? Like, can it actually, that would actually be a question I have. But please, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna a very sort of minor point, and I don't even know whether it's relevant at this point, but the other thing that I think we should note about religion is that it is also organized, and that it has churches and it has infrastructure, and that those are sites that do a lot of community building work. And I mean, it can be reactionary community building, but it can also be, for that reason, also community building in different ways. So that, I think, is a thing. If we shouldn't exclusively think of religion in its sort of transcendental, mystified, dreamlike sort of state. Instead, there are actual physical components of it. And if you want to get married, somehow you've got to be in a church. And if you are, if you're out of money, and one place you can go is to the church. If you're homeless, you're going to go to a church, and so on and so forth. So the sort of infrastructural elements of religion, I think, are also useful for thinking through why they could be a kind of an impure form of Marxism, or lend themselves to that way in certain ways.
That's really good. I'm thinking here of The Pursuit of the Millennium by Cohn. It's a great book about the precursors to anarchism and socialism and communism from heretical movements during the Middle Ages. The movement of the Valdesians, the movement of the Free Spirits, the Franciscans, and then this had a crescendo with Munzer. But all of those movements, also, if you look at Marcel Gauchet's incredible book called The Political History of Religion, are themselves expressions, according to Gauchet, of an implicit atheism in Christianity, precisely because those movements themselves were heretical, largely from their theological, cosmological point of view, on the basis of their materialism. They were overly materialistic, therefore they disrupted what you might call the court religion, or the superstructural version of religion. So I think the interesting thing, and I think you obviously see this a lot in slave rebellions, especially in America, right? And Horn talks about this as well. Most of them are led by charismatic people, such as Nat Turner, who themselves had literacy and who themselves had an immense fluency with the Bible, such that they were either able to perceive their calling as divinely ordained to rebel, because there's that whole distinction between resistance and rebellion in the slave context that I've been studying a lot lately, because I'm interviewing Gerald Horne on the program soon. So I've been like immersed in this literature. And that's sort of the point. And even with John Brown, right? So there's also a question of religion and leadership, and the charismatic leader, and the leader who can break with orthodoxy, because I don't think that the claim is that the revolutionary tradition begins in orthodoxy. I think it begins in a break from orthodoxy most of the time. Akshay, please.
No, I mean, I just wanted to agree a lot with what Jonathan just said, but I guess, like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, for some reason, I began drawing a triangle, and I thought it was sort of interesting that, like, if you use sort of like real, symbolic, imaginary, you could sort of technically, like, I mean, and it's, I guess, the sort of difference between the analysis, like in the 18th Brumaire, right, like where you get kind of what's actually like in the situation. And I guess this is this question of like, concretely, you never kind of have the pure situation of like capital. You never have kind of proletariat and bourgeoisie, but you have these kind of like formations of like class compromise in some sense, right? Like, and I think that was what, both this question of religion and like, I mean, and in the, real, I guess, is sort of this category of struggle, right? Like sort of, but I guess that's where I was a bit, the question that I sort of had for everyone was like, the place where I was sort of floundering a bit was this question of like the last section of the chapter. Like, I mean, I agreed with most of what was said, right? Like, I get this idea that these are all class struggles in the sense that if we adopt like a labor theory of value, like just in the, like, who's doing the work and like what are the ideologies being used to justify their work not being work, right? Like kind of in a very simple sense. But, I mean, in the last section, it's kind of like this, it's social subjects who kind of directly or indirectly pertain to the social order, to some essential articulation of the division of labor. And so, I mean, I guess on the one hand, there's this invocation of like recognition. It's almost like a Whigs and Hunters kind of situation, or like race, right, where there's these social actors. But then there's also like talk about kind of production. And I mean, I think that does go back to this question of like, what is class reductionism or even production reductionism, like in some sense, but it's like, I don't know. So it's not I guess the question was sort of, I was wondering what people thought about this idea that of social subjects and what is the emphasis here on social subjects. Like, I mean, for example, like in a 13th century kind of conflict, like between the church and like, or two interpretations of like, like there's the mystified understanding and there's the, the revelation of what it really is, which is, I guess, in some sense, class struggle. And yeah, I guess that's not really a question, but it's, I'll just leave it off there. I think you're muted.
Yeah, this is helpful, actually, because part of this also revolves around his larger theory of the First World War as the sort of unique combination of the overloading of these contradictions from the three primary species of class conflict, and how there like emerges a crisis in which the war becomes an inevitability imposed from on high, almost in the same similar way that we have the theory of Bonapartism. It's like world war is when bourgeoisie cannot summon forth a Bonapartist solution for the pacification of the class struggle. They go all the way in on it in some sense. And that I felt was a useful, like if we look at page 44 through 45, where he says on closer inspection, the First World War was not merely an expression of the class struggle, but it pertained to A, the struggle for hegemony between capitalist bourgeoisies, B, to the social conflict in the metropolis, in which the bourgeoisie wanted to neutralize that conflict and deflect it internationally. That's imperialism, by the way, because I think another thing that is noted here that we didn't mention is imperialism. And imperialism has a origin in the writings of the early Marx and Engels with a displacement. It's a theory of a displacement of internal metropolis out. Like So in that way, I think it's useful to invoke this category, broadly speaking, of social subjects and a theory of antagonisms, and why Marx cares about taking sides within bourgeoisie class conflict, whether that be internal to bourgeoisie or whether that be bourgeoisie against ancien regime or against aristocracy. Because in some sense, the outcome of the bourgeoisie's class struggles internal to itself will have huge determining effects on things like war, imperialism, and all of that. And then he says, C, World War I was a response to the oppression and exploitation of peoples in the colonies and in semi-colonial conditions. The social question posed as the national question. So that was interesting to me as a theory of, and you get this a lot in like Koji and Karatani's work as well, about a Marxist theory of the inevitability of war in certain social sequences when the class struggle becomes what you might say overdetermined or overloaded. And it's interesting because on the one hand, if you think about that theory, and let's say that it has some explanatory power or merit, it also means that part of the liberal theory of the trepidation of Marxism, which I think is real, is that a lot of liberals will say Marxism is too much fire, in the sense that if you disturb the beast, like you could almost think about it like this, like the class struggles within bourgeoisie. Liberalism defines itself as saying those are the sufficient arena in which class struggles should occur. It's too much to ask bourgeoisie to engage in class struggles from below. That's why liberalism I see as seeking almost like a maintenance of social class through this prism of stabilization and pacification of working class struggle from below. Does that make sense? I was thinking here of this funny commentator. Oh, I forget his name. He's a writer for The Nation magazine. And he was saying that the left failed because it allowed for the unruly movement of Bernie Sanders, just as the right failed by they allowing the unruly movement of Donald Trump. I think that's a good example of liberalism, right? Which is liberalism has no tolerance for class struggles from below. And I think one thing that is true about Marxism, it's not that Marxism fetishizes class struggles from below, but I think that Marxism sees the engine of true transformation of capitalism as emanating from them. And those include these three: colonial, struggle of women, and the struggle of the exploited working class. Anyways, please, Aaron.
Yeah, so I actually really just had a clarifying question that came up when I was doing the reading, and then also now with Akshay's comment and yours, Daniel, which is about this kind of question of teleology, which I couldn't really parse what Losurdo is saying in the text about. So we have these three species of class conflict, and what was confusing to me was whether these can exist simultaneously and whether they can be instrumentalized at the same time to achieve a kind of a singular goal, or if what Losurdo is saying is that they have to be achieved in kind of sequence. In other words, and I think that, like, for instance, does the nation need to be secured so that the sort of the class struggle against capitalism can fully be undertaken? Do you see what I mean? In other words, we know that capitalism and the nation state form are deeply bound up with one another. Is the point of national struggle to achieve the nation state so that this second round of class struggle can occur to overcome capitalism more holistically?
Right.
In the same way and you see this debate in radical feminism, which I'm not an expert in at all, but
Yeah.
in other words, is it liberation for women to be emancipated from the domestic labor of the household and become a wage laborer? And is that a teleological progression insofar as when they become a wage laborer, they can participate in the class struggle against capitalism?
Mm-hmm.
You see my point? And so, like,
Yeah.
is it that these species are are part of a teleology, or they're part of a sequence, or is it that they can exist simultaneously and all can and are they're moving in tandem to achieve a singular goal? I don't know if that question makes sense, but it was just something that I was struggling with reading the text, and then now again, kind of as we've been talking.
Well, I think that Losurdo in the introduction, yeah, does he not leave this question as the question that Marx and Engels themselves said that we could never give a proper answer to that? And my feeling there was almost that that is not meant to be a question with a determinate answer. That there is a situational analysis required for that. Think, for example, of like Mao in Privileging Imperialism, or think, for example, of the Communist Party of Lebanon, which says the highest contradiction for us is solidarity in anti-imperialist struggle, given our proximity to Palestine and the oppression of Israel, right? Think also of a lot of leftists in America who look at Palestine today, and I've heard this, I'm sure many of you have heard this, and try to say that it's ultimately a distraction from working class struggle in the core regions, for whatever they think that it's incorporating a sort of lens or paradigm of liberation that doesn't fit the domestic struggle, that there's an asymmetry or something. And I think we've spoken in sessions before about how maddening I think that claim actually is. But that's actually Marxism right there, in the kind of contrapuntal, heterogeneous fact of the multiplicity of class struggles. There has to always be thought, their conjuncture. Their conjuncture has to be thought and processed, and action needs to be taken accordingly vis-a-vis a party, vis-a-vis organization. So, Luis, please.
Yeah, so between the things that I like about his reading is that we start from different forms of class struggle, right? So we take in consideration already this multiplicity, right? Instead of univocal reading of class struggle, right? So there is class struggle between nations, right? In the imperial core, right? And the periphery. And there is class struggle in the family too. But when it comes to religion, so back to religion, right? He says, for Marx, religion is one of the ideologies, not ideology as such, right? And then he talks about, there is the problem was not Christianity against Protestants, right? It's actually the conflict that emerges, in capitalism. And that's why these two religions were in conflict, right? But I think there is class struggle in the family, right? There is class struggle in religion itself. Like there is the difference between right-wingers and left-wingers, right? One that tries to use religion to defend the class structure, and one that tries to use religion to subvert the class structure, right? But the thing is, I think that it's not just that religion is just one of the ideologies, that it's the ideology itself, right? Because if you become aware that there is class struggle in religion, it means that you are seeing this whole of your totality of religion that is split, right? It is already overcoming ideology, right? So in that sense, I don't agree with Losurdo's reading of religion, that it's not ideology. I think it's the superstructure of all ideology, right? So that's my take.
Yeah, that's good, Luis. I mean, I think perhaps your comment reflects societies. I think some societies have a saturation of religion in which their superstructure is determined by them, in which the formation of the subjectivity at a cultural level presents a worldview, right, that is absorbed by the citizenry in such a way that it's very difficult and thorny to get on the other side of being able to see the internal splits and contradictions within that religious worldview. I'm not sure that that's true in a lot of our contemporary as much. Perhaps some societies more so than others. but I think I see your point. In other words, just so for clarification, you're saying that you value his idea that religion is internally fractured, but you disagree in the sense that you still are you trying to say, Luis, that religion does not therefore possess a kind of emancipatory kernel?
I mean, I'm saying that, I mean, why we think about religion that positively? Because in, I mean, the 60s, right, there is this, you know, this rethinking about religion, right? And there was this idea that, you know, we have to get rid of ideology, when in fact, you know, socialism, the Marxism, it is a religion, right? But instead of refusing Marxism because it's a religion, we have to see religion as part of Marxism, right? And in itself, right, religion not just as the institution of Christianity, Protestantism, but as a worldview, right, of an individual, right? So in that sense, right, I think that acknowledging class struggle, right, within that worldview, right, that totalizes your worldview as a religion does, is already overcome when you realize that there is class struggle, right? It fractures your worldview, right? Your worldview is fractured by these two classes, right? Like, I mean, like a religious, like a fundamentalist will not see that. And I think that's important, right? Because if not, we'll have just a clash of two fundamentalisms, right? And we will not have this, you know, solidarity among the proletariat, right?
Okay, so as I understand your point, Losurdo's reading of Christianity is not critical enough regarding the sublation, the necessary sublation of religion, because he leaves room for Marxism being a kind of non-antagonistic theory of religion or continuation of religion.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, okay. That's valid. No, that's an interesting critique. Actually, do you have a second point?
It's
Please.
sort of about what Aaron had asked, and it's I mean, so I think a religion's emancipatory potential will always be conjunctural. It's like what religion and what situation, and like to this question of like I think in a sense like all religions, I mean everything in the world is imminently class struggle already. Like we don't need to come and make a party for it to become class struggle. It is the ontology of the historical process that it is antagonism, right? Like, but there is the point of class consciousness, right? Like it is class struggle, but is it class struggle by a class that knows itself as a class and that acts as a class? That like, and that's the whole question is it revolutionary? Right? Like kind of, so I mean, at that point, like it does, there's the question of course, in a latent fashion, everything is class struggle, but what is I mean, sorry, sorry, I'm getting my terms mixed up. But I mean, between the sort of like manifest and the latent, like in an abstract sense, we know that it's, I mean, or in a concrete sense, we know that it's all class struggle, but it's like, how do we find the political line, which is kind of always the conjunctural question? And I mean, I think it does come back, this question of class keeps on coming back because it is at a sense of like class consciousness, right? Like, and it's like some nationalist movements may perhaps in certain points, you know, like in the post-colonial world, like foster a form of class consciousness. But if nationalism is not doing that, then it's in no sense sort of revolutionary, right? Like kind of, so for example, like, you know, you may understand peasants as being a manifestation of class struggle, but like in sort of like Marx's own description of like kulaks, right? Like it's kind of, anyway, I mean, and I think going back to the question of like, religion is a form of leadership, right? So hegemony, or displacement and disguising of the class struggle, which may have some, in a sense, some kind of revolutionary aspect. But like I think what Losurdo's offering Marxism as is not that, oh, we should join the party or just do that, but that the paradigm of class struggles kind of offers a framework to unify these struggles. And the answer to that isn't worked out. You know, it can't be, right? Like kind of, yeah.
And nor is it like some sense that every national struggle results in an achievement of the national question and therefore the social question, which then leads to proletarianization and then leads to a kind of globalized theory of like proletarianization that leads to some great final battle between bourgeoisie and proletariat at a, I mean, we may come to that, but I think that yeah, I think that the theory of imperialism and interstate rivalry amongst bourgeoisie means that in order for capitalism to persist, there must be a continual regression in the non-core peripheral regions. The peripheral regions must remain in a certain state of underdevelopment as a necessity for capitalist development, so that in a sense their struggles will remain there. You know, they will be blocked from that. And so you get a kind of regressive theory of capitalist development. And I know that like in South America, like Gabriel Tupanamba, one of my comrades, is huge on peripheralization theory, out of world systems theory, which really puts a big onus on that idea, which is ultimately a theory of the temporality of capitalism, right? Which is to say that the future of capitalism already exists, at least for the subjects and the citizens of the core regions, in the periphery. So that the periphery points to a form of life that that proletarianization in the core will become. Yeah. That's actually why for people that live in the West, it's so useful to spend time in the global South, because you learn organizing tactics which will become useful as, you know, austerity and immiseration continues in the core. Julie, you had your hand up. I wanted to just revisit to see if you wanted to jump in before we go to Jonathan.
Yeah, I wanted to go all the way back
Please.
to what you were talking about in the beginning. And I think that so loosely, there are two types of people who study books and people who don't. And when you were talking about earlier about the conflict that happened after the George Floyd summer, about, okay, so do we fight the racial struggle, or, you know, are we class reductionist, etc.? I don't think this is a problem for the people who don't read books, because what I hear people tell me is it's not about that. It's about all of these things at the same time. It's like a silly question to say, oh, well, should we engage in this, you know, struggle for racial liberation, or should we struggle in this class liberation, which it's because it's the same thing. And Losurdo says it's the same thing, but I think that people on the street also believe it's the same thing. And your question of strategizing how to prioritize, I think there's a very simple answer to that question, is you take the opportunities that are laid before you. So it's not prioritizing, okay, we're going to prioritize the class struggle, blah, blah, blah. It's what can we do right now? What can we do right now? That was it.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. That's huge. I mean, this goes back to, I think, his argument against people that are anti-Marxist or critical of Marxism, because for them, Marxism has missed its historical moment, like Habermas said. And what that means is that the dialectic of liberation and freedom is no longer a question, because the dialectic of liberation and freedom for thinkers like Habermas can be handled through technocracy, through technocratic means, through policy, through social policy. That's liberalism. So liberalism does, I think, have an aversion to this, to the idea that people demand a form of liberation, that we are a society in which liberatory demands can still have currency, can still have efficacy. That is the triumph of a certain form of thinking politics that I think that's actually where the reverberation of these false dualisms come from, Julie, I think, which is a certain technocratic liberalism. And I wasn't advocating that. I was just simply saying that it has paralyzed a certain discourse on the left. So, I mean, I totally agree with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. So one thing that I've been thinking about, and I think Julie's point's a great one, and maybe my point piggybacks on this in a way, but it's that if we're thinking, one of the sort of sticking points or problems is that if we're thinking of those three types of class struggle that he mentions, one of the kind of historical problems is that, and why prioritization becomes a sticky problem, is because oftentimes one group will throw the other under the bus. I'm thinking about, women's suffrage wanting to distance itself both from the poor and from African Americans. And I'm thinking about like different kinds of the white working class, wanting to, remain a kind of white working class, and the sort of racism built into the white working class. And so you have these different, where there's, I think the usefulness of the Losurdo is partly in that it says all three of these are class struggles, or that we have to think of class struggle more broadly to be able to incorporate all of them. And yet, one of the things that the reason they don't disappear into one, the reason why we still have to think of them as three separate, or as three or more separate spheres, is because otherwise we do end up with this sort of what you could call class reductionist claim, which is that, okay, well, all three will go away if we just unionize or something like that, right? That this will be somehow, that would be, if we just take care of the economics, then everything else will be solved. And I think it's less, I don't know the answer to whether that would happen, but historically the problem is that people who say let's just take care of the economics ultimately throw the other two categories under the bus, race and gender. And then people who, and so there is a kind of historical tension between these three categories that I think is worth, that Losurdo's aim here is a good one, insofar as saying all three of these are class struggles, so that we can see them as having a common struggle, which is important for building solidarity between the three, and for understanding class struggle as more broadly. But it is also, I think, useful in naming the three, insofar as we can't just collapse them into one. Even if we call them all class struggle, it's important not to think that they can be easily collapsed into a single one. Or I should say, at least historically, they have been oftentimes more at odds than usefully expressing solidarity. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It's very close to his claims in Western Marxism that we're familiar with by now, which is during the civil rights movement in the United States, a lot of Marxists had a tacit refusal. They thought the civil rights movement through a technocratic lens, and they thought it therefore as something solvable within the arena of bourgeois politics. And I think that the value also is not just these three subordinated social subjects. That's important, but it's also the overdetermination onto those three social subjects by bourgeois forms of ideology as well, and by forms of conceptualizing liberation through these other quote unquote other paradigms, and the necessity for a Marxism which is an impure but class-based analysis. But again, when we say class-based analysis, we don't mean that we're selecting one of the three. Because the other point, of course, is anti-colonial, the ignorance of anti-colonial struggles in Marxism, which is a huge problem as well. Matilda.
A great discussion. Thinking about all these things. I'm thinking about how he often brings in this concept of the global division of labor as like affecting the gender situation, like will affect the global division of labor or will affect the division of labor. Like all of the categories have a relationship to the division of labor to him. And I think it's, I mean, we are studying Marxism, and it is about what is required for humans to reproduce. Like it's about our self-reproduction and our metabolism with nature and our social reproduction and families. And when we start using the word economy so quick, we abstract away into this mechanical world that's like kind of forgets that like at root we're animals that are just trying to like survive, and that there are forces that help us survive, and they tend to push out other forms of survival that aren't as useful to us. And it does seem like there is at least it seems to me there's a teleology in Marxism towards stronger means of production that are able to do the job in a stronger form. But I guess what I was trying to say is they're all connected by the division of labor and how they all have an effect. If you manipulate any of those three factors, you're having an effect on the division of labor. Which brings us back to the economy as the key to history. And I think that's why he culminates in the 13th section. He gestures towards 1885. Engels speaks to the theme. It was Marx who had first discovered the great law of motion of history. The law according to which all historical struggles are in fact the more or less clear expression of struggles between social classes. And this question of history and class struggle is related to the science of history. And what Marxism's wager is to me is this like science that allows you to understand history. And Engels in the late 1800s in his Feuerbach essay, the historical materialism section, is very clear about how like we've come to understand that nature has laws. And with Marx, we've come to understand that human history has laws of development. And that the forces that can account for the quiescent laws of history is class-based forces, not individual ones on the human-to-human base level. The different, it's class forces that are the levers that are strong enough in which when we analyze, we can understand the laws of the history of development of human history. And then this is where he includes what goes wrong, why, maybe not what goes wrong, but like why class struggle never appears naked on the stage of history. And I mean, he more or less says that all class struggles are political struggles. And why is that? Because, or at minimum, they're political struggles. And why is that? Because the state came into being whenever society started to diverge into classes. Like in a long, long time ago, the state is the common interest of society, et cetera, et cetera. And because we convert our interest, because the state is necessary for society, the social organism, as it's kind of said in the later 1800s, it requires us to translate our interest into state speak or ideological speech, which speaks at the level of general interest. And so like once the state comes into being, our interests become opaque to us, because in order to act upon our interest in the society in which a state is, we have to translate it into this legalistic language that obscures the economic interests, the motive forces, and that upon that basic appearance, like the first appearance upon the essence of history, are further ideological layers, and that they only kind of get more opaque as you go up. And I just wanted to remind us that I think, you know, Losurdo is gesturing towards that conception of history, with human history with laws. And it does seem like he kind of develops along a lot of different lines that are documentary and that don't necessarily come back to that, but he does dovetail back at the end towards like kind of the traditional theory of the laws of history and Marxism. And I found it really persuasive in a lot of ways. I still don't know what to make of, like, you know, many things like how religion works. I don't think it's really developed in Engels very deeply. So I mean, like, he's just kind of building upon, I think, what he came before him. But I just wanted to add that.
Excellent summary. No, thank you, Matilda. I can tell you've gotten a lot out of the text. Yeah, I mean, I think he's making a strong defense of historical materialism here, without question. I think, you know, next time it's going to be really interesting because we take a slight pivot when we then introduce, like, what is an emancipatory struggle and this whole theory of what is recognition, you know, and then the gradients between the three primary social subjects. They experience it differently, I think it's fair to say, right? Tume, please.
I just wanted to add, you know, one of the, you know, often when I'm reading, I focus on a phrase, on a word, and, you know, the class struggle thing really hits me because, you know, coming where I come from, the word struggle has always been a thing used colloquially, right? But it's been an individualized thing, right? The struggle, the everyday struggle, Biggie Smalls, you know, the everyday struggle of the singular person, right? And then you bring in this class struggle. So we would be remiss, I think, to not, we talk about George Floyd's summer, to not think of the postmortem of it that's left so many confused and questioning, especially on the Black left, why the Black liberal aristocracy was able to take it and make tons of money. And it did not leave us with more organizations of strong political projects. And you have to then come back to the Panthers, right? And the idea that what they connected, what Losurdo was talking about, that this is a class struggle, their Marxist application was, we must make an organized political project for Black people that is one of liberation. It's not just a reactive to all the things that are happening to us. It is a proactive movement trying to establish something within the eternal colony, and then, you know, linking themselves to Palestinian liberation struggles, Vietnam, so forth and so on. And it becomes an internationalist thing. And I think, you know, when I think about the movements now, and what Losurdo's intervention to me is so important is because there is a way that now, and it could be a reaction to many of the white left wanting to separate the Black struggle from class struggle. I do acknowledge this possibility, but it has been separated in many ways in people's emotional connection and in wanting to grab Marx. Look, I have these conversations and people see Marx as alien. Like you bring it up, Daniel, many on the Black left. They consider themselves left, but they don't want to embrace socialism and communism. And I do think a hostility towards thinking of Blackness as long legacy class struggle from the white left or Western Marxist left is part of it.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting, though, because the class analysis of the Panthers was very sophisticated and highly strategic, in the sense that they had a futuristic understanding of a particular development of how late capitalism and even finance capitalism was eviscerating the Black proletariat in a very particular way, so that productive labor was actually not seen as a ground, in my reading of the Panthers, of where revolutionary agitation could be most fecund or most deliver the goods. And I feel like, irrespective of these squabbles on the left, everybody should be incorporating a class lens purely for strategic reasons, because class agency moves history. It moves history. And I think this idea of Marxism as a wager on strategic class valves of interest, like Matilda was saying, remains a constant, but also something that changes for Marx. Like, I'm big on this idea of Marx's response to the Paris Commune as changing his whole conception of the state itself, as changing his whole idea of how to position class antagonistic and create how to rival bourgeois power. That has to mutate as the class struggle mutates. So there needs to be, I don't want to use the word pragmatism, because I know enough about how pragmatism has a troubled history with Marxism. But let's say like a situational awareness of strategy needs to be incorporated here. And I think an acknowledgement that it's also these liberal and bourgeois frameworks of understanding class as a general theory of social antagonism. That, I think, has a huge merit, because if we present Marxism to the left, whether it be the Black left in America, in this valence, as composed of these three primary social classes, as multiple, as heterogeneous, and as a strategy for liberation, I don't see how anybody can kind of deny that. I don't see how that can be denied as futile or as outdated or as antiquated. I think it's such a superior mode of analysis for social change. I just don't see how you can do that. I mean, I know the history and the tattered disputes and these squabbles, and it's interesting that a lot of public figures today, especially during the Biden era, after the Floyd uprising, I don't know if you've noticed, but they have like no ideology. So many people today, I would claim, have like no ideology, in part because they're scared. Because I think the forces of bourgeois liberal reaction are so strong that when a real liberatory movement for recognition, like the Floyd movement, actually takes place, you got forces coming from 360 degrees that are ready to co-opt it. And so then it becomes a question about its emancipatory kernel and the fidelity to its emancipatory kernel. You know what I mean? And that, I think that Marxism has to prove that it has the best social epistemology to guide the full blossoming and the full expression of that. Anyways, is it Aramis? I apologize.
Aramis, yeah.
Aramis, please.
So I like that you brought up the word pragmatism. It actually reminds me of a funny story. I once visited another group in another area of the city where I live, and it was a group that focuses on homelessness and helping out homeless population. And I was participating in the discussion there, and I said, I want to think of some pragmatic solutions. And one of the guys there, who had been there many more times than me, he said, "Fuck pragmatism." And I thought that was kind of a feeling that I got from a lot of people who are more outwardly revolutionary than I am. Like, I am very revolutionary, I think, inside, but the way I deliver the words sometimes is kind of more measured, which that's not a critique on him, but I kind of felt like he didn't really get that I was on his side. And so that sometimes that can happen when you try to introduce like maybe pragmatism or just even like tactics. Sometimes the solidarity can get frayed a little bit. But so that's one point. And another point that I thought of when Mtume was speaking was my father. He is indigenous, and I'm part indigenous. I wasn't raised completely by him, but I was around him and around some of those communities. And as I grew up, as I graduated into my later 20s and now I'm in my 30s, I started to think, why aren't more of these indigenous people Marxists? Like, why aren't more of them communists? Why don't they like say that? I find it to be very much consistent with some indigenous cultures at least, but I feel like there is kind of a reticence to kind of embrace that ideology, maybe just because it originated on another continent. Not by all. I don't speak. I don't want to generalize too much. I know that some indigenous people are Marxist, but that's another point that I had. And then the final one was I really liked Matilda when she was talking about that all those three labels of class in the text they always kind of relate back to labor. And the way I see it is those labels are good models for using for Marxists, and I think that highly useful, but they're not the only labels, and I'm sure that there are more labels that might be discovered in the future or that were already tried in the past. And so it's kind of like Marxism is a really cool method. I'm so glad to have discovered in the last couple of years, and the methods can evolve just like science evolves and introduce new models. So I think that's something that might happen, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
It's wonderful to have you. Yeah, I mean, it is always a question, right, regarding Marxism and its sort of popularity as academic or only like this sort of postmodern problem of Marxism, where it's like only the educated, like Julie was saying. So there is a sense in which Marxists need to rekindle the rawness of Marxism as a pure expression. Like, this idea of the norms of bourgeois society as norms that are not necessarily like our friend. Then, like, so of course civility and some like basic norms are friends, but there's also a sense in which in order to reach non-bookish people, Marxism needs to adopt a vernacular, not that's not anti-intellectual vernacular, but there needs to be some kind of capacity for Marxism to open up a receptacle where the expression of social antagonism can be felt, can be known, and I feel that a lot of socialist groups and organizations that I encounter, sometimes their cultures don't lend themselves to that rawness, and I would love for them to be more reflective of that rawness that you find on the street, that you find when you talk to people that are in poverty. You know what I'm saying? Because in a sense, it's already a doctrine that is, I don't want to use the word intuitive, but that has that, yeah, that it should reflect that natural yearning for emancipation. I don't know. Jaira, welcome. How are you?
I'm okay, a little under the weather, but really excited to be here. So well, there's like actually so much because this text came at such an interesting time where there were so many things happening at the same time that were converging. But even initially looking at the cover, I tried looking up like where this came from because I thought it was just an interesting thing. But it I remember when I was reading the opening pages that were talking about the Great Depression and things of the sort, it felt the image was coming together very clearly for me, and I really felt this kind of like like Americana vibe. And ironically, I came up on like a ton of American Studies journals that have really elucidated for me this emphasis in Section 13 around a general theory of social conflict. Just because so American Studies for me is a discipline I definitely was not familiar with in terms of its range, its scope, or even really what it's contending with. I had really not paid any attention to it, but I found all of these journals, so I've just been reading like so much academic writing about this exact dimension of what we're talking about, this like general theory of social conflict and how it's being replicated. And there's been, I don't know if anybody's read Tip of the Spear by Dr. Orasan Burton, but it's a text that for me, I mean, like blew my mind open in terms of coalescing the Black struggle with militarism and with the, and he, I believe his, no, I think he's an anthropologist by training. But used a deeply social methodology to really tend to these questions of like, how do we look at prisons and their entire operation themselves as like a counterinsurgency tactic? And I mean, it's just an like really, really brilliant work. But where was I going with this? So there was a quote, the Benedetto Crossi, when he talks about the concept of power and struggle, which Marx transported from states to social classes, now seems to have reverted from classes to states. That keeps coming up a lot for me in all of this American studies reading that I'm doing, just in terms of looking at the different dimensions of how state formation has ultimately seeped down into these various, whether it's institutions or even just like more social dimensions of how people are moving across space and time and place. Place is like huge. And again, just like looking at the cover, I remember looking at like the sand and being like, is this like a desert? Like I was really trying to figure out like, what is this trying to evoke? Because for some reason it was so like just strange to me, these guys with these briefcases, but sorry. Anyway, yeah, that quote really stuck out to me. And even just to circle back to what you were saying earlier today, I was on a call with a bunch of people from different organizations and different think tanks that are working across climate and militarism. And I'm more of the like anti-militarism, that's more my jam, but the group that I primarily organize with, we definitely have a very broad analysis that includes the environment as like a central core tenet of redistributing funds outside of the military industrial complex. And so we are working with like labor. We just kicked up a new campaign in the DMV area addressing or working in coalition rather with Amazon and Google workers who are trying to shut down Project Nimbus, which is like a cloud-based software that's being utilized by Israel. And in making those inroads, we're confronting a lot of the questions that you were just addressing in terms of like, how do we, or at least me, that's definitely my orientation of like, in working with these laborers who for the better part are driven by a very like moral imperative, don't necessarily have the full scope of the idea of like what the economic engine really is around Amazon, Google, and now the deployment of this kind of like technology that is now a part of statecraft, right? Like this is the new dimension we're stepping into, where whether it's a border that what's the company that made the border both in Gaza but also in the Dominican Republic that just went up, that's shutting out Haiti. And the Dominican Republic already started mass deportation campaigns against Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent, as well as our own natives who are just Black Dominicans. So we're already experiencing that there. And Israel was key to us beginning to rebuild or rather reinstill our state formation to be one that is ethno-nationalist and white supremacist. And obviously this experimentation started in occupied Palestine. So all of that to say that this kind of idea around social conflict being expropriated and really cementing itself within class struggle that then gets deployed by the state, but then also like renegotiated within social conflict, I feel is like very, very alive right now and very present. And I think that just a plug for anybody that's interested. I think American Studies would be a really good, I can send anybody articles if you want. if there's anything you're particularly interested in, but I think there's like so many different, whether it's regional assessments of like what we refer to as Appalachia or what we refer to as the South, that these are obviously very politicized concepts. Like there's almost like a geopolitics to the South, Appalachia, even New England, where I live. Like all of these things are all very mechanized in this way, but also very, very obscured by this mythology around like the United States. And I think that there's hints of that coming out, and I wonder if it will come up even more, just in terms of like how ideology and mythology play together to really, really ingratiate these kinds of things individually, kind of how he talks about we're just in a habit of replicating these social dynamics more than it is necessarily a conscious choice. And I think that's like really so much at the heart of why we can't break past this argument of like, why don't I feel represented in whatever notion of Marxism that exists, and why are Black people not galvanized enough by the image of like Karl Marx and how he articulated, when we have so much proof of his analysis being extremely integrative, but still something about how these concepts of labor and class and race all just got like muddled together in this notion of like anti-Americanness and Americanness, right? Like that was the whole anti-communist Red Scare. Like these people are fundamentally anti-American, and we haven't yet decided what comes forward then. If we are going to be as communists decidedly anti-American, then what is next? And so this question of like where all these things are bound up in our institutions and in our social relations is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. Thank you for that. There is a lot of censorship about Domenico Losurdo in the American Academy that you guys should be aware of, just because I have some experience in publishing. And so part of the reason that the cover is so bad, like this is dumb, is for a reason, which is that a lot of publishers on the left are pretty terrified of getting Losurdo out. And it's just a fact. I know it firsthand from experience. With his Stalin book, it's very pronounced, but with all of his work, it's very pronounced because there is a very interesting fact that Losurdo is very widely respected amongst historians and philosophers, even philosophers that he criticizes. I'll give you an example. Did you notice that on the back of the book, Vattimo gives it a testimonial? That is incredible. If you know anything about Losurdo's relationship to Gianni Vattimo in Italy. In his book on Nietzsche, Losurdo attacks Vattimo as like the worst instantiation or example of left-wing Nietzscheanism. He basically thinks that he spiritualized the struggle and the Italian Communist Party. He's Heideggerian, he's left-wing Heideggerian. And anyways, it's just funny to me that Losurdo is having a moment in our context, which I think is for good reason, because it's quite lucid and it's quite accessible. Here he is making a kind of case for the scientific efficacy of historical materialism, when the most popular Marxist right now, Saito, in Degrowth Communism, is arguing that historical materialism is Eurocentric and that we must abandon it. Here, Losurdo is showing that it's nothing like a Eurocentrism at work in historical materialism, right? And he's showing Marx and Engels as fabulous and like essential thinkers of anti-colonial liberation. So I don't know, like I'm not going to say it's a conspiracy that the cover was the way that it is, but I think it's a weird choice. Sorry, Luis.
I actually like the cover. I don't know about you, but I like the cover. But what I really like about Losurdo is this interest in this global system, right? Because I mean, we focus on the nation and you know, these minorities, right? But in the global scale, like how did these minorities came to the US? Like this is something that liberals don't talk, right? They just like, let's accept each other, but how do all these people came to this country, right? It's the whole history that is erased, right? If you track all that history, you have to understand global capitalism, right? If not, you wouldn't make the logic of this whole history, right? And at the national level, right? it comes back to this notion of class struggle and division. It's not like there is this, I think, self determination of the nations. Like, this is what I'm skeptical towards, anti-colonialism, because who tells you that this group represents the people of X country? No, there is an inherent division between nations, right? And there is class struggle between nations. And what, all these nations strive is to have the working class party to rule, not to make, us against the empire, right? So there is inherently this division, right? And I think that's what makes, like, and at a more individual level between minorities, what's more terrifying about accepting this class struggle is to see this class struggle between our own group, right? There is such division within our own group, right? Not just us against that, like this Schmitzian, we need an external, an external oppressor. No, this is fascism, right? The fascist needs an external oppressor, right? And this is, I think, why I'm skeptical towards this anti-colonial, because it can also reach that conclusion, right? And my other point, right, about pragmatism, right? I mean, pragmatism has so many. Pragmatism comes out of American reading of Hegelianism, right? Because the conclusion of pragmatism is almost Hegelian itself, right? Because, I mean, if we read Marxism, right, there is this inevitability for the system to collapse, right? And pragmatism at the end is like, what is practical, what works is what we must do, right? Because the problem of Marxism has been like, there is this loss of history, and we know what to do, right? No, at the moment when the system crashes, you don't know what to do, right? And there is no intellectual that knows what to do, and this is how we can bring this to the people, right? That we all, can find a way how to do based on reality, right? Not on an ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, very compelling stuff. I think you're hitting the question of the necessity of the international working class movement, which is in retreat in our time, unfortunately, because that would be one of the only sort of solutions to the problem of the internal class fracture of anti-colonial struggles that you pinpointed. And yeah, I just wrote an article on the history of pragmatism and Marxism in America. And one of my conclusions, just very quickly, is that pragmatism made American Marxists uber class reductionists in a paradoxical way. Partially because they would read the condition of like the worker through this Deweyan idea of habits and like natural dispositions, and they would ultimately derive a kind of highly reductionist idea of capacities. So they would then, like in the Second International, organize socialist organizations on a highly exclusionary basis. It's a whole thing. It's worth looking at. Brendan, welcome.
Hi. I wanted to just pick up, I guess, on the on this question of of Losurdo's contribution to our understanding of Marx and Engels as prime anti-colonial thinkers. And I'm reading this. I think like one of the most helpful parts were the first few sections of him discussing national struggles as a form of class struggles and anti-colonial struggles as forms of class struggles. And it reminded me a lot of a question that kept popping up in our last reading group on Western Marxism, of how to be an Eastern Marxist in the West, or how to engage in this kind of anti-imperialist Marxism that Losurdo advocates, because of course the tactics that are undertaken in national liberation struggles are not necessarily directly applicable or easily transferable to the proletariats in the imperial core. But I think here he gives reads into Marx and Engels. Or not, I'm not say he reads it in, but he really kind of gives us a really clear sense of their answer to that and how they thought about the anti-imperialist struggle even before you reach the stage of monopoly capitalism. And this section I just want to read a quote that stuck out to me a lot, because in my city, I'm in Canada, and a lot of Marxists take this really derisive stand towards anti-imperialist Marxists and kind of slander anti-imperialists as campists, saying they're nothing better than people who are just siding with the Chinese camp or over the Western camp. It's this sort of very frustrating line that I think, when they were really, this was really, really big, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when you really started to see them having to grapple with the rise of China in the context of COVID. And I wish I had read this by this time, because I think he just answered, the frustrating thing to me was they were very much arguing that the geopolitical struggle is a distraction from the class struggle, which implicit in that is this separation of geopolitics from class struggle, which to me is a resolutely anti-Marxist line, to think that there could be something called geopolitics that is somehow disconnected from class struggle. And I think that he just does such a great job refuting that notion. And, because they will often selectively quote Marx and Engels to say that we should not be focusing on these national struggles. We should just be focusing on the struggle of the working class in China, or the struggle of the working class in Venezuela, as opposed to defending Venezuela as such in the context of imperialist assault, or defending China as such in the context of imperialist assault. And this just struck me as a very unconstructive line. And I think that Losurdo just really hits the nail on the head in this quote, which is on page 9. He says, while the oppressed nation was enjoined to wage its struggle on the widest possible national basis, the task of the proletariat in the oppressor nation was to nurture its antagonism towards the ruling class, thereby furthering its own human emancipation, and at the same time contributing to the emancipation of the oppressed nation. And I think this just made this quote really sticks out to me also in the context of the discussion we've been having here about how to prioritize these different forms of class struggles. I think the real contribution is that while there may need to be the contribution of Losurdo is that while there may need to be tactical decisions about what to prioritize in a given moment, I think Losurdo really helps us see the way that these are all mutually reinforcing struggles, and that by properly understood, properly connected to the dynamics of class and social reproduction under capitalism, with a proper understanding, I think communists have the ability to realize these mutually reinforcing potentials of these various forms of class struggle. And I think that's just especially helpful as I think we're starting to see a kind of maybe a reassertion of the debate between Western Marxists and anti-imperialist Marxists.
Brilliant, Brendan. That's really, you guys this has been an excellent first session. I think we'll close fairly soon. We'll hear from Noah, but yeah, it's so funny because it's like revolutionary defeatism in the core region while supporting subordinated state socialist regimes at face value presents almost like a double standard, which we know right-wing socialists will say, okay, let's actually tail bourgeois parties and sort of mimic the platform of state socialism that pre-exists in Cuba, Venezuela, China, and force that into existence in the American context, which I think is different than what you're saying, right? Because I think what he's trying to say in that quote is kind of like something like a variation on revolutionary defeatism in a way in the core region, but class struggle still happens. But that doesn't necessarily mean that class struggle in the core region needs to be tied to some kind of instrumental reproduction of the party form as it exists in these other locales that we strategically support, if that makes sense. Anyways, brilliant stuff. Noah, please jump in.
So this is all very new to me. Losurdo's very new to me. I don't know a whole lot about this. I wanted to kind of when you mentioned earlier, Marxism needs to develop a vernacular that opens up to the, you know, the non-book others, in a sense. Like, I'm just kind of wondering, because I'm this whole notion of working class has definitely ruptured my reality, in a sense. This realization that, like, oh shit, like I am I'm in the working class, and like I definitely I don't see any way of like ever coming out of this. And it's like definitely it's kind of put me in like a very difficult place. And I want to have more conversations about this notion of classism. And when I talk about it with other people or other coworkers, they don't see it as a problem, or like um it doesn't exist in the way that it exists for me as like a detrimental problem. And I'm just trying to wonder, like, what would it look like to create a vernacular for people that for the non-book other, to like really create a dialogue in this, because when I do try to bring it up, it becomes more antagonistic and abrasive. And I'm just trying to understand, like, what would it look like to create or unfold a different type of vernacular for this, for more dialogue within people that within the working class.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I mean, this is part of the mission of what we're doing here, I feel, in some sense. I mean, this is why I'm very excited to speak to a thinker, a philosopher like Jacques Rancière, who dedicated much of his scholarship to this precise question, which was that he noticed that in the 19th century, Marxism was a kind of Enlightenment discourse of intellectuals that were preaching down to workers a theory of their liberation. And he said, well, what were the workers that theorized from below up? What were they saying? The ones that didn't get published, right? And then he studies them. He studies their frameworks of emancipation and then compares them to the established so-called intellectuals. Because Marxism is an intellectual enterprise, and I think it's become overly intellectualized, to Julie's point and to your point. And I noticed that you got a lot of hearts when you were talking, Noah, from folks in this session here. So I think you're hitting the heart of the question, and I think we should just continue to ask that question over and over. I don't presume to have the answer to that. I invite actually others, if others want to jump in, if you're inspired by what Noah said, to share thoughts. A lot of it's organizational culture. The fact that the Trump phenomenon has happened again is whiplash of a different order, of a magnitude that's maybe even more pronounced than the first time. And the first time was an existential crisis for most of us on the left. And now it's a sort of numbness, right? But in that numbness, there should also be a humility, because it indicates to me that the cultures that we've developed on the left are not giving that space of a receptacle for the very thing you're talking about. How can they? How can we do better with that? I mean, yeah, you have a generation that's become proletarianized, right? That doesn't have the promises of social reproduction available to it. So there will be coping mechanisms that will fall in line with the therapeutic, with self-help culture. You know, I've written a lot about that. For a Marxist, for Losurdo, he would probably categorize that as other paradigms, right? So I think part of it is the framework of Marxism, as I mentioned before, is an epistemology that's hot, almost like too hot to handle. So we also need to make it like less hot to handle. You know what I mean? I think sometimes it's a bit intense.
Yeah.
To see the world through class is intense.
Yes.
Let's be honest.
I agree.
It's intense. So we need to de-intensify that But it's also liberating to see the world through class. So we need to show the way that it can be liberating. We need to do both. We need to like de-intensify and intensify at the same time, if that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you.
Other thoughts? We close soon. Other thoughts on Noah's comment as a wonderful way to end.
I'll just throw one thing in there.
Please.
I mean, this was what Walter Rodney's whole life was about, the idea of the organic intellectual and not producing work for the academic class, but producing work within the social classes that you're trying to liberate. So the work that you would actually write and create would be within a kind of dialogue or dialectic with them. So if you read Rodney's work, there, as robust as it is not hard or difficult to read. And it's funny, that kind of easiness. I mean, I think for his guy and his people, he definitely also had to keep a certain kind of ramped up energy because they don't want anything too easy to deal with. They want that kind of fire to a certain degree. But there is a way when you read Rodney's work, he is expressing it through a means of the people on the ground, the groundings, as he called them, right? So I think, he to me is someone to look. And he talks about how he went about this too. He was sadly, he died so young, but he talked about this process and how this process, and he detailed it very, very, very much in the time that he had.
That's
one
amazing.
question, sort of
Please.
like, what did you mean by de-intensify? But I guess like I felt like a lot of the thrust of this was sort of like we needed to like sort of tap into intensity where it was and not kind of invent it. Like you don't go around proselytizing being like, but it's like the intensity is already there. You know what I mean? Like but yeah.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, I think that there is a plausible theory to be made that large sections of the American working class, largely through the culture industry and through various depoliticizing institutions, have forced an internalization of their subjectivity to be depoliticized, and that certain questions about their subjectivity are not permitted to be asked. So I think we're talking about a movement of a spark of politicization for a new generation undergoing forms of evisceration and proletarianization, for which a lot of institutions don't give them the equipment to name that. There's a question of naming that, and then it's also a question of by de-intense, I just am responding to Noah's point about I guess the sense of like to become politicized or radicalized. I guess what I'm hearing from Noah, which I have some sympathy with, can be overwhelming. Would you agree with that, Akshay?
Yeah, fair enough. I mean,
do you see my point? Is that what you're saying, Noah? Am I clear in what you're saying?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if there's a difference there, it'd be interesting to see. But I mean, I resonate with what Noah's saying myself. I think it's
so this is a silly question.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So, anyways, I'm very pleased that y'all were here. We'll post this video soon, and yeah, I put the readings up, and join the Discord, join the conversation. I got a stream on liberalism and socialism with Matt McManus on Thursday night, and then I'm very excited for the interview with Dr. Horn on Thursday morning. And if anyone's interested, I posted the questions. It's going to be on the American Revolution or Counter-Revolution, his text on 1776. So I posted my questions for him just so folks can kind of have access to that. And if you want me to ask any further questions, hop into the Discord and take a look at that. I can try to make it as collaborative as possible. So with that, I think we shall close. Thank you all very, very much. All the best. Peace out.